The bear kept going to the police station. Officers decided to follow him. They were shocked by what they saw. It was an unusually cold night in the small town of Grizzly Creek, Montana. The streets were empty, and the soft hum of the wind was the only sound breaking the silence. Inside the police station, the lights flickered, casting shadows across the old wooden desks. Deputy Ben Harris was finishing up a late shift when the strange sound began. At first, it was subtle, just a distant thud against the door, like someone pounding on it with heavy fists. Ben paused, his eyes narrowing. The noise came again, louder this time, echoing through the dim hallway. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a passing vehicle. It was rhythmic and deliberate. Someone or something was knocking on the door. Ben stood up quickly and walked toward the entrance, his boots making a soft echo on the wooden floors. He glanced at his colleague, Officer Sarah Walker, who was sitting at her desk, flipping through a case file. "Did you hear that?" Ben asked, his voice low. Sarah looked up, frowning. "Hear what?" "The knocking," Ben replied, his eyes darting toward the door. Sarah hesitated, her brow furrowing. "It's probably just a prank. You know how these small towns are. Someone's messing with us." Ben wasn't convinced. He had worked here long enough to know when something felt off. The town was peaceful, almost too peaceful. There weren't many calls at this time of night, and most of the people who lived here respected the officers. But this was different. He reached for the door handle, his hand trembling slightly. He opened it cautiously, expecting to see nothing more than a few scattered leaves blowing in the wind. But what he saw shocked him to his core. A massive, dark figure loomed in front of the station. It was enormous, easily over 10 feet tall, with a wide, thick frame. The creature stood on two legs, its massive paws reaching up to pound on the door once again. The fur was matted, dark, and thick with the chill of the night air. It was a bear, no doubt about it. Ben froze, his mind racing. What the hell? Sarah rushed to his side, her eyes wide in disbelief. "Is that a bear?" "Yeah, but it's doing more than just standing there," Ben muttered, staring at the creature's massive paws, which were now gently tapping on the door like a person knocking. It wasn't behaving like a wild animal, it was acting purposeful. Just then, the bear let out a low, mournful growl, almost like a sigh. Its deep brown eyes locked onto Ben's. There was something in those eyes, a kind of sadness, a desperation. Ben's heart pounded in his chest. He had encountered wild animals in his time as a deputy, but nothing like this. This wasn't an ordinary bear. This creature seemed human in a way. The growl turned into a soft grunt as the bear reached out a massive claw and gently scraped it against the door, as if trying to draw their attention. Ben and Sarah stood there, frozen. It was almost as if the bear was asking for something. But what? Ben could feel the tension building in the air. The cold night, the strange knocking, the desperate look in the bear's eyes, it was all too much to ignore. He swallowed hard and turned to Sarah. "I think we need to follow it." "What? Are you crazy?" Sarah snapped, her voice laced with disbelief. "It's a bear, Ben. It could kill us in an instant." "I don't know, Sarah," Ben replied slowly, his gaze still fixed on the bear. "Something's not right here. I've never seen anything like this before." Reluctantly, Sarah nodded. She could see it in his eyes, the same thing she was feeling deep down. There was something important about this encounter, something they couldn't just brush off. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "But we need to be careful. If it turns hostile..." "I know," Ben interrupted. "We'll be careful." They grabbed their flashlights and cautiously stepped outside, the door creaking shut behind them. The bear, still standing there in the moonlight, turned its massive head toward them. It didn't seem aggressive, it wasn't growling or baring its teeth. It was just watching them, waiting. Ben and Sarah moved slowly toward the creature, their footsteps muffled by the snow on the ground. They followed it as it moved down the street, the large figure lumbering ahead of them. The air was thick with tension, but neither of them could bring themselves to stop. There was a nagging feeling in both their minds, the feeling that they were about to uncover something far bigger than a lost animal. The bear led them through the dark streets of Grizzly Creek, past familiar homes, until they reached the edge of the woods. It paused at the tree line, its eyes turning toward them one last time, almost as if it was asking them to follow. Without a word, Ben and Sarah ventured into the forest, the sounds of the night closing in around them. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the snow-covered ground. They didn't know what they were about to discover, but they both had the same unsettling feeling. Whatever was going on, it was just beginning. The cold air grew heavier as Ben and Sarah walked deeper into the woods, the faint crunch of snow beneath their boots the only sound breaking the eerie stillness. The bear, moving with an unnerving grace for its size, led them through the thickening trees. It didn't glance back anymore, but Ben could feel its presence, its steady, deliberate movements drawing them further into the unknown. "Do you think it's lost?" Sarah whispered, her breath visible in the frigid air. Ben shook his head, his mind racing. "I don't know. Bears don't act like this. They don't knock on doors." He glanced around, unsure of what he was expecting. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Every crack of a twig underfoot seemed amplified, every gust of wind sending chills down his spine. Something felt wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The bear stopped suddenly, its large form silhouetted against the soft glow of the moon. It stood still for a moment, its head swiveling as though listening for something. Then, without warning, it turned and plodded further into the trees. "Ben, we need to stop," Sarah urged, her voice trembling slightly. "This doesn't feel right. We should head back." But Ben didn't stop. His legs moved of their own accord, his feet following the bear as if some unseen force was pulling him forward. He couldn't explain it, but he knew they were close to something. Maybe the bear had a reason for bringing them here. Maybe they were supposed to see something. "Just a little further," Ben murmured, his voice low but firm. He couldn't explain it, but he felt it too. It was a pull, a strange kind of gravity that had nothing to do with the forest, but everything to do with what lay ahead. They walked in silence for another 5 minutes, each step taking them deeper into the heart of the woods. The trees grew thicker, their branches twisting and gnarled, blocking out much of the moonlight. Ben could barely see his hand in front of his face, but he kept moving forward, trusting his instincts. And then they found it. The bear had stopped in front of a clearing, its massive figure silhouetted against the faint light of the stars. The clearing was small, surrounded by a circle of ancient-looking trees. In the center, barely visible in the dark, was a structure, a crumbling stone building half buried in the earth, its walls worn down by centuries of weather. It was a ruin, something old, and yet there was an unsettling sense of familiarity about it. Ben stopped in his tracks, his heart racing. "What is this place?" Sarah's voice shook. This doesn't make sense. There shouldn't be anything like this out here." The bear, sensing their hesitation, let out a low growl. It wasn't threatening, but it was insistent, pushing them forward. The sound of its growl echoed in the hollow clearing, reverberating through the trees. Ben stepped forward, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. As he approached the building, he noticed strange markings on the stone, carvings that seemed almost deliberate. They were ancient, almost faded beyond recognition, but there was something about them that seemed alive, as though the stone itself was speaking. "Ben, look," Sarah gasped, pointing toward a large stone slab at the entrance of the ruin. The stone was cracked, but beneath the cracks, there was an engraving, familiar, yet alien, something that tugged at Ben's memory. He knelt down to get a closer look. It was a symbol, an image of a bear. But not just any bear. This bear had strange markings running down its sides, symbols that seemed to match the carvings in the walls. And underneath the bear, there was a word written in a language neither of them recognized. Ben's stomach twisted. "What is this place?" Sarah stepped closer, her hand brushing against the stone, as though she was drawn to it. The air around them shifted. There was a sudden chill, and a voice seemed to whisper in the wind, a faint murmur that neither of them could quite understand. The bear, standing silently behind them, let out another growl, but this time it sounded more mournful. It was almost as if it was waiting. "Ben," Sarah said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and awe, "I think it's trying to show us something. This isn't just a bear. It's something more. Something important." Ben's mind raced. Everything about this felt wrong, But at the same time, it felt like they were on the verge of discovering something bigger than anything they could have ever imagined. But what? As Ben reached out to touch the stone, something extraordinary happened. The ground beneath them shook briefly, and the air turned electric. The carvings on the stone suddenly began to glow faintly, as though they were alive. A deep rumbling sound filled the air, and the bear took a step forward, closer to the stone. It lowered its head, almost as if it was bowing to the ancient relic. Before Ben could react, Sarah pulled him back. "Ben, get away from it. Something's not right." But it was too late. A sudden light erupted from the stone, blinding them both. Ben staggered back, his hand instinctively covering his eyes. The air felt thick, heavy, as though the world itself was shifting around them. And in that moment he understood. The bear wasn't just a bear. It was a guardian. And they weren't just in a random forest. They were in a place, an ancient place, where the past and the present collided. But what was waiting for them here was far darker than they could have ever imagined. The blinding light from the stone faded as quickly as it had appeared, but the forest around them didn't return to its previous quiet. Instead, the trees seemed to groan under some unseen pressure. The very air felt heavier, as though the earth itself had taken a deep, unsteady breath. Ben blinked rapidly, his eyes adjusting to the sudden dimness. His heart was pounding, and his legs felt unsteady beneath him. What in the world had just happened? The carvings on the stone were now glowing more faintly, almost as though they were breathing, shifting, alive in a way that defied reason. Ben's hand was still pressed against his eyes as he tried to orient himself. He turned his head to find Sarah, who was standing beside him, her face pale and wide-eyed. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out at first, as though the air itself was too thick to allow her voice to escape. "Ben? What is going on?" she finally managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. She looked back toward the stone, her gaze locking onto the symbols that now seemed to pulse in rhythm with the deep, slow hum that had filled the clearing. The bear stood unmoving, almost as if it were in a trance. Its enormous head lowered toward the ground, and for the first time since their strange encounter began, it seemed vulnerable, defenseless even. It was no longer a beast of power and menace. It was something more fragile now, connected to the very ground beneath them. Ben took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. The air was thick, almost electric, and the realization hit him like a wave. The bear was guiding them here for a reason. It wasn't just a lost animal. It was a guardian, one whose role in this ancient place had been set long before they even stepped foot into these woods. But for what? What was this place? What had the light been? And why did the bear seem so expectant? "Ben, do you see this?" Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. She was pointing toward the glowing symbols. The engraving beneath the bear had changed. It had expanded, and now a faint, spectral image of a figure, half human, half beast, was rising from the stone, its form twisting as though it were being conjured from the very earth itself. Ben's stomach dropped. He felt an overwhelming sense of foreboding wash over him. This wasn't just an archaeological discovery or a forgotten ruin. This was something far more dangerous. He could feel it in his bones. The weight of whatever ancient secret was buried here was not one that was meant to be uncovered. Before Ben could respond, the ground shook again, this time more violently. The trees around them creaked and groaned, as if they were protesting against the intrusion. The bear's eyes flickered toward the trees, and Ben swore he saw someone, moving between the shadows in the forest. It was a figure, tall and cloaked in darkness, too thin to be human, with a presence that seemed to stretch across the entire clearing. It stepped forward, its movement unnatural and fluid, like smoke wafting through the trees. It stopped at the edge of the glowing stone and slowly, deliberately, turned its gaze toward them. For a moment, Ben couldn't breathe. His body locked in place, frozen by the figure's presence. Sarah gasped and took a step back, instinctively reaching for her gun, but Ben could see that it was no use. No weapon could protect them from whatever this was. The figure spoke, but the voice was like nothing Ben had ever heard. It wasn't a whisper, nor a shout, but a deep, reverberating sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from beneath the earth, from the sky, from the stones themselves. "You've disturbed what was never meant to be disturbed," it said, the words sliding into their minds like poison. "The balance is broken, and now you must pay the price." Ben's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to speak, to demand answers, but he couldn't move. He couldn't think. Every instinct he had screamed at him to run, to get out of there, but his feet remained rooted to the spot. The bear let out a low growl, but it was not one of aggression. It was a sound of warning. The figure turned its eyes toward the bear, and for a moment, Ben saw a flicker of something like recognition, or maybe understanding, pass between them. "The Guardian has failed," the figure continued, its voice now louder, more insistent. "It was meant to protect, but it has allowed the truth to be forgotten." Ben's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of what he was hearing. Guardian? Truth? What was this figure talking about? He couldn't make sense of it. The figure reached out toward the stone, its fingers elongating, twisting into unnatural shapes. As it touched the stone, the ground trembled once more, and the air seemed to hum with energy. The symbols on the stone began to pulse faster, brighter, their glow becoming so intense that Ben had to squint to keep his vision from being overwhelmed. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the shaking stopped. The figure stood perfectly still, its hollow eyes locked onto Ben and Sarah. "You will never leave here the same," it intoned, its voice now an echo in their minds. "You will learn the cost of forgetting the past." And with that, it dissolved into the shadows, leaving nothing behind but a faint, lingering chill in the air. The bear, its role now clear, stepped forward and stood between Ben and Sarah, its large body a protective barrier. It looked at them one last time, the sadness in its eyes almost unbearable. Then, it turned and lumbered back into the forest, its massive form disappearing into the darkness, leaving them alone in the clearing. Ben looked at Sarah, his mind spinning. He didn't understand any of it. The figure, the stone, the glowing symbols, it was all too much. But one thing was clear, their lives had just been irrevocably changed. They had uncovered something far darker than they had ever imagined. And whatever had been hidden here in the woods, whatever ancient truth the bear had been guarding, was now waking up. The clearing was silent again. The oppressive stillness of the woods seemed to close in around Ben and Sarah, the weight of what had just transpired pressing heavily on them. The bear was gone, the figure dissolved into the shadows, and the air was thick with the echoes of the words they'd heard. "You will never leave here the same." Ben stood there for a moment, his mind struggling to process everything that had happened. The stones were glowing softly now, their light dimming gradually, but still pulsing faintly in the cold air. His heartbeat echoed in his ears, and his hands were clammy. He wanted to move, to run, but something inside him, a deep, primal instinct, told him to stay. This place, this moment, it was important. He looked at Sarah, who was standing a few paces away, still holding her gun, though it was lowered now. Her eyes were wide, her expression a mix of fear, confusion, and disbelief. "Ben," she whispered, her voice shaky, "we have to go back. We have to tell someone. This isn't normal. We don't know what that thing was. We don't know what any of this is." He met her gaze, his own expression grim. I know, but we can't leave yet." Sarah's eyes narrowed, and she stepped closer to him, lowering her voice. "What do you mean?" "Ben, this isn't something we can just walk away from. Whatever that was, it wasn't human. It wasn't even something from this world. And that bear, there was something about it. It's like it knew us." Ben looked back toward the fading glow of the stone. "It was trying to show us something, Sarah. Something real. It's not just some freak accident. There's more here. I can feel it." Sarah's mouth pressed into a tight line as she surveyed the clearing, her mind clearly working through the implications of what they'd just experienced. Her eyes flicked to the trees at the edge of the woods, but nothing moved. The oppressive quiet of the place felt like it was pressing in on them. "I don't know what we're dealing with," she said finally, her voice hoarse. "But we're not going to get answers standing here. Whatever the hell that thing was, we need to find out why it's here, and why it's connected to that bear." Ben nodded, his jaw clenched. He wasn't ready to leave yet, not with so many questions swirling in his mind. But he knew she was right. They needed answers. But we head back to town, he said, his voice steadying. But we can't go straight to the station. We need to figure this out ourselves first. We need to know what we're dealing with before we bring anyone else into this. Sarah hesitated, her gaze flicking nervously to the dark woods around them. And what if we don't make it out of here? She asked softly. What if we're already too deep in? Ben felt a chill run down his spine, but he shoved the thought aside. They had no choice now. The danger wasn't just about them, it was about whatever had been disturbed in these woods. Whatever force had been awakened by their presence. They made their way back toward the town, their steps slow and deliberate, but every few minutes, Ben would look over his shoulder, half expecting to see something following them. But the forest remained as still as death. There were no sounds of movement, no growls or whispers in the wind. Just the echo of their footsteps as they ventured back to the safety of the town. It wasn't until they reached the edge of the woods that they both heard it. A distant, mournful howl, carried on the wind. Ben's blood ran cold. The sound was unmistakable. A bear. But it wasn't the sound of a wild animal calling to its kin. This was different. This was human. A cry for help. And it was coming from the direction of the clearing. Sarah stiffened beside him. Ben, that didn't sound right. I know, he said, his voice tight. That wasn't a normal bear's howl. They stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of what they were hearing. But the sound was growing louder now, a low, anguished cry that reverberated through the woods, echoing off the trees. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The silence was deafening. Ben felt his heart pounding in his chest. We have to go back, he said, already turning toward the woods. Sarah grabbed his arm, her grip firm. No, Ben, we can't. It's dangerous. Whatever that thing is, whatever we've woken up, but he didn't listen. He couldn't. He felt something pulling him back. Something deep within the earth, beneath the trees, beneath the stones. The cry had been a signal, an urgent call. Something or someone was waiting for them to return. And he wasn't sure they had much time before the truth came rushing at them, faster than they could run. Ben, Sarah hissed, but he was already moving. He didn't know what they would find when they went back. He didn't know what that cry meant, or why it had been so human, so full of suffering. But he knew one thing for certain. They had unleashed something. And it wasn't finished with them yet. As they stepped back into the woods, the cold wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it a low, mournful growl. This time, it wasn't just the bear. There was something else, something older, something darker, lurking just out of sight. And whatever it was coming for them. The wind howled again, biting at their skin as they ventured back into the woods. Ben felt an overwhelming sense of urgency, his body moving almost instinctively as if it knew what was waiting for them in the shadows. Sarah's grip tightened around his arm, pulling him back for a moment, but he shook her off gently, his face set with grim determination. I can't explain it, Sarah, Ben said, his voice low, almost to himself. But we have to find out what that cry meant. It's like a warning, like a cry for help. Sarah looked at him, her expression torn between fear and disbelief. She had known Ben long enough to understand when he was on the verge of making a decision he couldn't walk back from. But this was different. They weren't just investigating a bear or a strange occurrence anymore. They were stepping into something much darker, something beyond their understanding. We're playing with fire, Sarah said, her voice shaky. We've already crossed a line. What if that thing, whatever it is waiting for us? What if we're not supposed to be here? Ben turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and a deep, unspoken fear. I don't know what we're supposed to do, but if we don't face this now, it'll only get worse. We've already woken it up. We need to understand why. The forest around them seemed to shift, the shadows between the trees growing deeper, as if something unseen was watching them. The stillness from before was gone, replaced by a sense of oppressive tension. The faint glow from the stones still lingered in Ben's mind, pulsing as if beckoning them forward. They continued on, the mournful cry echoing again, fainter now but unmistakable. It was as if the sound itself was guiding them, pulling them deeper into the heart of the woods. With every step, Ben's heart raced faster, as though the forest itself was alive and breathing around him. The air felt thick, heavier than it had before, like a storm was gathering, and they were its eye. "Ben," Sarah's voice was barely audible, trembling with fear. "Do you feel that? Like we're not alone anymore?" Ben paused for a moment, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. There was no denying it now. They weren't just being led by some supernatural force. They were being hunted. The hair-raising sensation that something, or someone, was watching them wasn't paranoia. It was real. He looked at Sarah, his jaw clenched. "Keep moving. We're close." As they pushed forward, the forest seemed to grow denser, the trees bending inward as if they were closing in on them. Ben's flashlight barely cut through the darkness, the beam faltering as though it, too, was afraid to reveal what lay ahead. And then, just as they thought they couldn't go any further, they saw it. The clearing was ahead, the stone ruin now visible through the veil of trees. But something was different. The ground around the stones had shifted, the earth churning as if something was moving beneath the surface. The low rumble they had heard before returned, like the sound of distant thunder, growing closer with each passing second. And then, through the fog of unease that clung to the woods, they saw the bear. It stood in the center of the clearing, its enormous body blocking the entrance to the ruin. But this time, it wasn't the same bear they had encountered before. Its fur was matted, its eyes bloodshot and wild, and there was a madness in the way it moved, a frantic, almost desperate energy that sent chills down their spines. But it wasn't alone. From the trees surrounding the clearing, figures began to emerge, tall, shadowy shapes with eyes glowing a pale yellow, their features twisted and distorted. They were humanoid, but something was deeply wrong with them. They moved with a predatory grace, their long limbs stretching unnaturally as they slithered toward the center of the clearing. Ben's heart raced as he recognized the creatures for what they were. They weren't human, they weren't even animal. They were something else, something ancient and twisted. The bear, their apparent guardian, was the only thing standing between these creatures and the stone. And they wanted it. A figure stepped forward from the group, taller than the rest. It had a long, gaunt face, its eyes empty, yet full of something incomprehensible. It wasn't a bear, but it bore the same symbol they had seen carved on the stone earlier. Its voice, when it spoke, was like a whisper carried on the wind, full of malice and ancient knowledge. "The guardians have failed," it hissed, its eyes glinting with a cruel, knowing gleam. "You have awakened the curse, and now you will never escape." Ben's breath caught in his throat as he realized what was happening. The bear had been protecting the stone, the ruins, the balance that had been in place for centuries. And now, with the arrival of these creatures, the curse had been unleashed. The stone, the symbols, the ancient power they had awakened, it was all connected. And they were trapped in the middle of it. "We have to get out of here," Sarah whispered, backing up slowly, her voice trembling with fear. But it was too late. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the bear let out a deafening roar. The creatures advanced in unison, their movements swift and eerie, closing in on the stone. Ben knew they couldn't run. They had to do something, anything, to stop them. The bear, their only hope, was too weak to protect them now. And then, just as the figures surrounded the stone, a piercing cry filled the air. It was the same sound they had heard earlier, the cry that had drawn them back into the woods. But this time, it wasn't a call for help. It was a warning. The stone began to glow brighter, the symbols lighting up in rapid succession, pulsing with an intensity that felt like it could burn them alive. The creatures hissed, recoiling from the light as if it was burning them. Ben looked back at Sarah, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Get ready. We might have one chance to stop this." They had no choice but to stand and fight. But against what? They didn't even know what they were facing. The battle for the truth had begun. And nothing would ever be the same again. The air crackled with energy as the creatures began to recoil from the glowing stone. Ben's heart thudded in his chest, and a flood of adrenaline surged through his veins. This was it. This was the moment where they either made their stand or were consumed by whatever ancient evil had been unleashed. The bear let out another roar, louder this time, its voice echoing off the trees. But it wasn't charging the creatures. It wasn't fighting them. It was standing its ground as though it was waiting for something. Waiting for them to do something. Ben's pulse quickened. The bear, despite its fierce appearance, seemed helpless against the creatures that surrounded it. It had tried to protect them, but now, it was just a symbol of the failure to contain what had been set loose. "They want the stone," Ben said through gritted teeth, his voice barely audible over the rumbling of the ground beneath their feet. He turned to Sarah, his expression frantic. "We have to stop them from getting it?" "I know," Sarah said, her voice trembling but determined. "But we're not equipped for this, Ben. We don't even know what they are." "I don't care," he said, gripping the flashlight tighter. "I'm not going to let them take it." Ben started toward the stone, heart pounding. As soon as he moved, the creature's eerie, glowing eyes locked onto him, their movements swift and unnerving, like shadows merging with the darkness. They hissed, low and guttural, like a warning that if he stepped any closer, there would be no return. But he couldn't stop now. They couldn't afford to let whatever ancient curse these beings represented claim the stone. Suddenly, the earth beneath them quaked, and the air turned frigid, as though the forest itself was breathing in sync with the creatures. One of them, taller, more imposing than the rest, stepped forward, its eyes narrowing in on Ben. Its long fingers stretched out, gnarled and twisted, and its voice echoed through the air like the slow rustling of leaves. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered. "The stone is ours, not yours. You have disturbed the balance. Now you will die." Ben's mind raced. He couldn't take it anymore. They had to find a way to disrupt the flow, to stop them from getting what they came for. He glanced around wildly, looking for something that could help, anything that might turn the tide. He felt Sarah's presence behind him, felt the weight of her determination as much as his own. She had his back, and for the first time since they'd set foot in the woods, Ben wasn't alone in this fight. She would stand with him, no matter how dark it got. A shrill cry pierced the air, and Ben's stomach dropped. It came from the bear. The massive creature turned its head, eyes wild with pain, as one of the humanoid beings placed its long fingers on the bear's shoulder. The bear trembled, its limbs shaking, and for a moment, it looked like the creature's influence had taken root. "No!" Ben shouted, his voice hoarse. Without thinking, he charged forward, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her along with him. The light from the stone seemed to pulse faster now, as though it was reacting to their movement, reacting to the imminent threat. They reached the clearing just as the first creature made its move toward the stone. Ben's chest tightened. They had to act before it was too late. He gritted his teeth, forcing his legs to move, even as his mind screamed to run, to find safety. There was no time for that now. The creature reached out, its skeletal hand touching the stone. The air hummed with an unbearable intensity, and the symbols carved into the stone blazed with a fierce, unnatural light. "Ben, get back!" Sarah cried out. She had grabbed a fallen branch from the ground and swung it toward the creature, trying to ward it off. But it didn't even flinch. The moment Sarah struck it, the creature's eyes locked onto her, its face twisting in fury. "You think this will stop us?" it hissed. Its voice was cold, inhuman. "We are the keepers. You are nothing." The ground beneath their feet cracked, and suddenly, Ben understood. The stone wasn't just a symbol, it was the key to controlling the curse. They had to destroy it. Without thinking, Ben charged toward the stone. He threw himself against the base of it, his hands grappling for something, anything that might cause it to crumble. But the stone was impossibly heavy, and his efforts seemed futile. It didn't even budge. The creature's eerie form loomed over him now, and Ben's heart raced. It reached down toward him, its sharp fingers aiming for his throat. He barely had time to react before a massive roar erupted from behind him. The bear. With a newfound strength, the massive creature surged forward, knocking the shadowy figure away from Ben. The bear's claws swiped through the air, sending the creature flying back with a force that left it tumbling to the ground. Ben's eyes widened. The bear wasn't giving up, but it was struggling. The power it once held seemed diminished, like something had drained it. Ben didn't hesitate. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his last resort, a flare gun. Without sparing another second, he aimed it at the stone and fired. The flare shot out, bursting into a blinding light as it struck the stone surface. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The air was still. The creatures paused, their eyes wide with shock and fear. Then the stone cracked. It wasn't a loud sound. It wasn't an explosion. But the effect was undeniable. The crack spread through the stone's surface like a web, the glow of the symbols dimming as the fractures multiplied. The ground trembled beneath them, a violent shake that knocked Ben off his feet. The bear gave one final roar as the stone shattered, sending a shockwave through the clearing. The creatures screeched in agony as the light from the stone flickered out, the force of the stone's destruction sweeping through the woods. Ben's body was slammed to the ground, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. The air was thick with dust and ash. His vision swam, and his limbs felt heavy. He looked up to see Sarah, her face pale and her body trembling. But then he saw it. The creatures, once so terrifying, were now dissolving into shadow. The air shimmered around them, and one by one, the beings faded, their forms crumbling into nothingness. Their shrieks echoed in the wind as they vanished, leaving only the bear standing amidst the destruction. It was over. Ben struggled to sit up, his head spinning, and looked toward the bear. It was standing, but there was something different about it now. Where are you watching this video from? Comment below, we want to know. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Let's get to the story. The sadness in its eyes had disappeared, replaced by something softer, almost peaceful. Ben, Sarah whispered, her voice full of disbelief. Did we just? Ben nodded slowly, still trying to process the gravity of everything that had happened. We stopped it. The curse was broken. But the price had been steep. The woods were silent once more, but Ben knew they could never return to the life they had before. The past had been awakened, and it would never let them go. The clearing, once charged with an unnatural energy, had fallen eerily silent. The destruction of the stone had set everything in motion, a violent, unpredictable force that neither Ben nor Sarah could have anticipated. The creatures were gone, but the price was clear. The air still hummed with residual power, and Ben could feel it deep in his bones, like a warning that the balance, though restored in this moment, was fragile at best. Ben stared at the bear, which now stood motionless in the center of the clearing. Its massive form seemed to loom, its fur matted with dirt and blood, but its eyes, they had changed. The wild, frenzied look from before had softened into something almost human, a profound sadness that mirrored the emptiness in Ben's chest. It's over, right? Sarah's voice was quiet, her breath still ragged from the ordeal. She was standing beside him, her face pale as she looked from the bear to the destruction around them. We stopped it? Ben shook his head, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. The flare gun had shattered the stone, yes, and the creatures had dissolved into nothingness, but the feeling in the air, he could still sense it, like a shadow hanging just beyond the edge of his vision. The forest was quieter now, but not peaceful. It was as if something had been unlocked, and whatever it was had not fully left. I don't know, Ben muttered, his voice heavy with doubt. It's not over, Sarah. It can't be. Sarah frowned, glancing around. The woods seemed unchanged in appearance, but there was something deeply unsettling about the stillness. It wasn't the usual peace of nature. It was something darker, more foreboding. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their twisted forms casting long shadows in the dimming light. And then, there was that feeling again, that they weren't alone. Ben turned to look back at the bear, his eyes narrowing. It hadn't moved since the destruction of the stone, and yet, its presence was commanding, as though it was waiting for something. Waiting for them. It's as if it knows we're the ones who, Ben began, but his words trailed off as he saw something strange. A faint glow was beginning to pulse in the bear's chest, growing brighter by the second. Ben, Sarah's voice was tense with fear. Is it? Is it still alive? The bear's head lifted slightly, its eyes now fixed on them with a knowing, almost human quality. There was a deep resonance in its gaze, a weight that made Ben's heart race. It wasn't an animal anymore. It was something more, something other, something that had lived far beyond the reach of time. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the glow in the bear's chest flickered and went out. The creature collapsed to the ground with a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to echo through the clearing. Ben froze, unable to tear his eyes away as the bear's body began to dissolve into a fine mist, its form breaking apart, vanishing into the air like smoke on the wind. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, as if the forest itself exhaled a long-held breath, the ground trembled beneath them. Ben staggered backward, his pulse quickening. "What the hell just happened?" he breathed. Sarah stumbled next to him, her hand gripping his arm for support. "That wasn't just any bear," she whispered, her voice filled with awe and terror. "That was something ancient, something that was guarding this place. And now it's gone." "But not really." Ben's voice was steady, but his heart was hammering in his chest. That thing was more than just a guardian. It was part of something bigger. Something tied to the curse, to the stone. And it's still here. I can feel it. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and a low, rumbling sound filled the forest, like a growl reverberating through the trees. It wasn't the bear this time. It was something else, something darker. Something that had been waiting. The shadows around them began to deepen, swirling with unnatural energy as a crackling force rippled through the air. Sarah's eyes widened in realization. "Ben, whatever we've unleashed, it isn't over. We've only broken one part of the curse. The stone was the key to locking it away, and now that it's gone, Ben didn't need her to finish the thought. He could feel it, the darkness rising from the depths of the earth, slowly, inexorably. It was coming for them. Before either of them could react, a shape emerged from the trees. It was tall, unnaturally so, and it moved with an unnatural fluidity. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed with a sickly green light. A long cloak of tattered fabric billowed around its body, but it wasn't the appearance of the figure that sent a chill down Ben's spine. It was the overwhelming sense of power that radiated from it, the palpable hunger that seemed to be drawn to them. The figure spoke, its voice a whisper that seemed to come from every direction at once. "You thought you could stop it? You thought breaking the stone would break the curse?" Ben's throat tightened. "Who? What are you?" The figure tilted its head, its glowing eyes boring into Ben. "I am the Keeper, the one who was tasked with guarding the seal. You've broken it, and now you will face the consequences." Sarah gasped, her voice trembling. "The Keeper? The stone? Was it just a prison?" The Keeper's laugh was hollow, a sound like wind howling through the trees. "The stone was never the prison. It was a beacon, a warning. And now you've awakened what lies beneath." Ben's heart raced, but he stood his ground, his voice hoarse with defiance. "What lies beneath? What do you want from us?" The Keeper's smile was chilling. "It's not what I want. It's what you've brought. The balance has been shattered. And now, you'll serve as the offering." Ben's mind raced. He could feel the energy in the air building, the darkness pressing in from all sides. This wasn't just about them anymore. This was about the world itself. The curse had been waiting to be unleashed. And now that it had been, there was no going back. He didn't know how much time they had left. But he knew one thing for sure: the battle for survival wasn't over. It had just begun. The air around Ben and Sarah thickened, pressing in on them as if the forest itself was alive, responding to the Keeper's presence. The glow of the figure's eyes intensified, burning green like some otherworldly fire, and the ground beneath them trembled once more. This time, it wasn't just the earth that was shaking. It was as if the very foundation of reality was coming undone. The Keeper's form seemed to shimmer, its edges distorting in and out of view like a mirage. Ben couldn't take his eyes off it. Every instinct told him to run, to flee, but the heavy weight in the air, the pull of the curse, held him in place like a magnet. "You've made a grave mistake," the Keeper whispered, its voice slithering into their minds, wrapping around them like chains. "You've shattered the seal, and now the consequences must be paid." Ben's hands tightened around the flashlight. It felt like a flimsy weapon now. The Keeper's power was palpable, like an ancient force that couldn't be fought with mere physical strength. The creature, whatever it was, had been guarding something far beyond their understanding. And now, they were the ones who had awakened it. "I didn't know," Ben said, his voice raw with the weight of what they had done. "We didn't know." "You never do," the keeper replied, a cruel edge to its words. But knowledge does not absolve you. The stone was not a mere relic. It was a key to a door that should have stayed closed. You have opened it, and now it will be your blood that seals it once again. Ben's heart pounded in his chest. The keeper's words were like an echo in his mind, reverberating through every fiber of his being. The idea that their lives, everything they had known, could be wiped away by this ancient curse was too much to bear. He glanced at Sarah, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes were filled with a fierce resolve. We can't let it win, she said quietly, almost to herself. We have to stop it? Ben nodded, but deep down, a cold knot of doubt settled in his gut. Could they really stop something like this? What was the cost of their failure? Before he could voice the thoughts, the keeper raised one hand, and the shadows around them deepened. The trees seemed to bend inward, casting long, menacing shadows across the clearing. The air grew colder still, and Ben could almost taste the ancient power that flowed through the creature. It was the same power that had once bound the curse, and now it sought to claim them. The stone has failed, the keeper continued, its voice no longer a whisper but a booming command. And now, the world will feel the consequences. The gates to the abyss will open, and all who dare disturb the seal shall perish in the coming darkness. Ben's pulse raced. He felt the weight of its words like a stone pressing down on his chest. It was impossible to fight something so ancient, so powerful. But he had to try. He couldn't just stand there, helpless. Sarah, listen to me, Ben said urgently, his voice low. There has to be a way to stop this. We've broken the seal, but maybe we can rebuild it. Maybe there's something we missed. Sarah's eyes flickered with something, an idea, a spark of hope. The bear, she said suddenly. It was protecting the stone. It was more than just a guardian. It was a part of the seal. If we could somehow, before she could finish, the keeper's voice cut through the air, low and dangerous. You will fail. You cannot undo what has been done. The power you've unleashed is too great. It is beyond your control. Ben clenched his fists. He wasn't going to give up. Not now. There's always a way, he muttered. There has to be. The keeper's eerie laughter filled the clearing, a sound that made the hairs on Ben's neck stand on end. You think you can stop the inevitable? The seal was never meant to be broken. It is a part of the earth, a part of life itself. The balance must be restored, and only those who understand the price can make that choice. Ben's mind raced, trying to piece together what the keeper was saying. A part of the earth? A price? What did that even mean? But before he could dive deeper into the mystery, the keeper took a step toward them, its eyes gleaming with malicious intent. You've disturbed the balance, the keeper continued, its voice rising in power. And now the price will be paid. With a sudden motion, it raised both hands toward the sky, and the earth beneath them shook violently. The trees creaked and groaned as though they were being twisted from their roots, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. The ground split open in front of them, a jagged fissure appearing in the earth like a gaping mouth. From it, a dark, swirling mist began to pour out, filling the clearing with an oppressive weight. The darkness spread, creeping toward them, devouring the light. Ben's heart hammered in his chest. It was happening. The darkness was rising, and nothing they had done so far had been enough to stop it. We have to stop it, Sarah shouted, her voice full of fear and determination. But how? What could they possibly do against this force? The keeper had warned them. They had broken the seal. The curse was already in motion, and now it was too late to undo the damage. The darkness continued to grow, swallowing everything in its path. Ben could feel the cold, the weight of the curse pressing down on him, threatening to crush him. He turned to Sarah, his mind racing. There had to be something. Then a thought struck him, a distant memory of something he had read, something about the nature of the curse and the price that had to be paid. Sarah, Ben said, his voice trembling. There's a ritual, there's a way to seal it again, but it requires a sacrifice. She stared at him, her expression faltering. A sacrifice? What do you mean? Who? Before he could explain further, the keeper's figure loomed over them, its hands outstretched. You would offer yourself to restore the balance? A foolish choice. But no matter. It's already too late. The world will burn. And with that, the keeper unleashed a torrent of darkness that surged forward, engulfing everything in its path. Ben's chest constricted with panic. There was no time. No time for debate. He had to act now, or they would all be lost. He grabbed Sarah's hand. We don't have much time. Whatever we have to do, we do it now. The last remnants of hope flickered between them as the darkness closed in. The air crackled, thick with the weight of inevitability. The darkness surged forward, relentless, swallowing the ground beneath Ben and Sarah's feet. Every second felt like an eternity as the keeper's laughter echoed around them, reverberating through the woods, chilling them to their core. It was as if the forest itself had become an extension of the curse, alive, hostile, and all-consuming. Ben's mind was spinning. There had to be a way to stop it. There had to be a way to make things right. But with each passing moment, the darkness closed in tighter, the keeper's shadow looming larger over them. The ritual, the sacrifice, it was the only hope they had left. But Ben wasn't sure if he could go through with it. He glanced at Sarah, her eyes wide with fear but also determination. She was the only person he trusted in this nightmare, the one who had stood by him through everything. And yet, in this moment, he knew that whatever came next would change everything. There was no going back. Ben, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. What do you mean by a sacrifice? What are you saying? He swallowed hard, his throat dry. The curse, Sarah. It can only be undone if the balance is restored, but to do that, someone has to give themselves to the forest. To the keeper. It's the only way to stop the darkness from consuming everything. Sarah took a step back, her eyes searching his face, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Her voice cracked with disbelief. You're saying that someone has to die? No way. We can't do that. There must be another way. Ben's heart broke at the thought. He didn't want to lose her. But in that moment, the overwhelming weight of their situation crushed all other thoughts. The keeper's power was too great, the curse too ancient. This wasn't something they could fight with weapons or will alone. It's not about death, Sarah, Ben said, his voice firm, though it shook with emotion. It's about balance. The forest, the stone, the keeper, this whole curse, it was never meant to be broken. But now that it's been disturbed, the price must be paid. I think I can stop it, but I have to go into the heart of the curse. I have to face it directly. Sarah's face turned pale as she took another step back, her body trembling. Ben, please, don't do this. There has to be another way. I can't lose you. Ben reached for her, his hand trembling. I won't be lost, Sarah. This isn't the end. But we don't have a choice. This is the only way. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The wind had stopped howling, the forest silent except for the distant, menacing hum of the curse. The keeper stood before them, its green eyes glowing with an eerie light, waiting. It knew what was coming, and it reveled in their fear. You cannot escape what has been set in motion, the keeper said, its voice low and mocking. The darkness will consume all. And soon, the world will know what you have awoken. Ben turned back to Sarah, his heart heavy with sorrow. This is it. This is what I have to do. I have to go into the heart of the curse and make it right. Her eyes filled with tears. No. Ben, please. Please don't do this. I can't lose you like this. We'll find another way. We'll find a way together. Ben shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. I wish there was another way. But there isn't. You're the only one who can stop the keeper from following me. You have to seal the gate, Sarah. You have to lock it away before the darkness spreads. She looked at him, her face a mask of disbelief and grief. But how? How can I? You have the flare gun, Ben interrupted, taking it from his belt and handing it to her. It's the only thing that can light the way. You have to use it when the moment comes. You have to close the gate. If I don't make it back, you have to end it. You have to seal the curse. The keeper's laughter echoed again, louder this time, vibrating through the trees. So, this is the price you are willing to pay? A fool's choice. It matters not who steps forward, the end will be the same. The curse will consume all. Ben stepped closer to Sarah, his hands trembling as he cupped her face. I love you, Sarah. I always will. Before she could respond, Ben turned and began walking toward the keeper. The shadows seemed to part for him, the dark mist swirling around him, pulling at his body like invisible hands. Every step felt heavier, the weight of the curse pulling him down, threatening to swallow him whole. The keeper raised its arms as Ben approached. The air crackled with dark energy, and Ben could feel the pull of the abyss beneath his feet. It was here, the moment of truth. The choice had been made. There was no turning back. You choose to sacrifice yourself, the keeper intoned, its voice booming with power. Do you understand the cost? Ben nodded, his voice steady. I do. The keeper extended one long, twisted hand toward him, its fingers brushing Ben's chest. The moment they touched, a surge of energy shot through him. It wasn't pain, it was everything. The ancient power of the curse poured into him, filling him with the raw, chaotic force that had been locked away for centuries. For a brief moment, Ben thought he might lose himself in the darkness. But then he felt something shift, something inside of him. The energy was not just consuming him, it was aligning with him. He wasn't just a vessel for the curse. He was a part of it. And in that instant he understood. This was the moment of sacrifice. It wasn't about death, it was about merging with the curse, understanding its true nature. And if he could control it, if he could master it, he could seal it away once more. But to do that, he had to take it all inside of him. He had to become the gate. I'm ready, he whispered to the keeper. Take me. The keeper's eyes burned with a sickly green light. So be it. And with that, the keeper's energy surged, pulling Ben deeper into the curse. The last thing he saw before everything went black was Sarah's face, her eyes filled with love, fear, and a promise. The world went black. Ben felt himself falling, being pulled. The sensation was not like falling from a great height, but something far more disorienting, as if the very fabric of reality itself was twisting around him. The world he knew, the trees, the sky, the clearing, everything began to fade. He couldn't see. He couldn't feel. He couldn't even breathe. But he could hear. A whisper, low and insistent, tugged at his mind. It wasn't the keeper's voice. No, this was something older, something deeper. It was a voice that had been part of him since the very beginning. You are the balance. Ben's chest tightened. The balance? You have always been. The curse is not evil, not in itself. It is a force of nature. You have broken the seal, but you can restore it. You can control the curse, control the power of the keeper, but only if you understand its nature. Ben's mind was reeling. What was happening? He had chosen to face the curse, to embrace the darkness in order to stop it. But this was beyond anything he could have anticipated. The forest, the keeper, the stone, they are all part of you, part of this world. The power is within you. All you must do is accept it. He didn't understand. He didn't want to understand. The curse, the keeper, the price of the ritual, it was all too much. Yet, he could feel it now, that deep connection to something older than time itself. Something primal. But there was no turning back. He couldn't undo his choice, couldn't escape this fate. He was part of it now. Suddenly, a burst of light shattered the darkness around him. It wasn't bright in the traditional sense. Rather, it was an explosion of raw energy, pulsating with the rhythm of the earth itself. The light didn't blind him. It filled him. He could feel the power surging through his veins, his body becoming a conduit for the very forces of life and death, creation and destruction. The curse, the forest, the keeper, they were all part of this force. And he was its vessel. Ben. The voice broke through the maelstrom of energy, cutting through the storm of thoughts and power that had overtaken him. It was Sarah. Her voice, filled with terror, rang out like a beacon of hope in the chaos. Ben, please come back. He wanted to respond, wanted to call out to her, but he couldn't. His body was no longer his own. The power of the curse was too overwhelming, too consuming. Yet, in the distance, he felt her presence, her love, her pain. It anchored him. It was the one thing he could hold on to. Sarah. Suddenly, Ben's body jerked. The energy that had been swirling inside of him began to shift, to solidify. A wave of intense heat flooded his chest. The curse, the power, It was no longer just inside of him. It was spreading, reaching outward, stretching into the world. The darkness he had unleashed began to recede, pulled back by the sheer force of his will. But there was something else. Something he hadn't anticipated. The price. The voice again, insistent, demanding. To restore the balance, you must give up what you cherish most. Ben's heart froze. The keeper had warned him. The ritual required a sacrifice. A sacrifice that would seal the curse, but in doing so, would cost him everything he held dear. Sarah. He could hear her voice again, softer this time, as if calling to him from a distance. Ben, don't leave me. Please. I need you. But he could feel the pull of the curse, feel the darkness that threatened to swallow the world. He couldn't let it win. He couldn't let Sarah or anyone else suffer because of his mistake. The choice was clear now more than ever. The curse, the keeper, the stone, all of it had been part of a cycle. A cycle that he, for reasons unknown to him, had been destined to break. And in order to do that, in order to restore the balance, he had to make the ultimate sacrifice. He had to let go. Ben. Her voice again, this time closer, frantic, desperate. He opened his eyes, or tried to. The light around him was blinding, but through it, he saw her. Sarah. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, her eyes filled with tears, her hands outstretched toward him. But he couldn't go to her. I'm sorry, Sarah. A wave of sorrow, of guilt, washed over him. He loved her. He would always love her. But the curse, the power, it had to be sealed. And in order for it to end, in order for the world to survive, he had to be the one to pay the price. The energy around him began to coalesce, the forces of the curse and the keeper merging with his own will. He could feel it deep within him, the power of the earth, the power of the ancient forces. It was too much to contain. He couldn't hold on to it any longer. He had to let go. With one final, anguished cry, he released it. The earth shook violently, the energy swirling around him, dark and light intermingling in a violent explosion. The ground beneath them cracked open, and a powerful burst of light shot into the sky, banishing the darkness and sealing the curse away. Ben fell to his knees, his body exhausted, his heart breaking as he felt the last remnants of the curse fade. The forest, the keeper, the stone, it was all gone now. The power that had been unleashed had been sealed away. And with it, Ben's own life force began to fade. Sarah ran toward him, her voice calling his name. She reached him just as the light began to fade from his eyes. Ben, she cried, shaking him, her hands frantic as she tried to hold on to him. Oh, no, please don't leave me. But it was too late. Ben's body had already begun to dissolve into the very earth he had saved. His last breath was a whisper, carried away on the wind. Tell them, it's over. And with that, the curse was sealed once more. The darkness was gone. The forest was silent. And the world would never be the same. If you've made it this far, comment, officer, like, and share. This helps us a lot. Subscribe so you don't miss the next videos.